Now, as you open to chapter 3 of your Bible or your iPad or whatever, let me just remind you what's going on, okay? Now, we have established that the central theme of Romans is the gospel. As simple as that sounds, that's the theme. And Paul's going to wrestle with it from several different angles throughout the letter. Now, again, you'll recall that one of his major points as he started the letter is that the gospel of Jesus Christ was talked about beforehand in the scriptures, referencing what we call the Old Testament today. So it's hugely important to him that we realize that God has one threaded message that you would follow from Genesis through to Revelation. And that single threaded message it finds its fulfillment in the person of Jesus Christ. But it is not new. Okay? So that's fundamentally important to a lot of Paul's arguments. Now, obviously, the Jews would not agree with that, but he, as a saved Jew, has that biblical enlightenment and understanding. He has made the statement in the first chapter that the gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to people. And so as he then unwraps that throughout the letter, you'll remember that starting in chapter 1, verse 18, his first concern is, why is there a need for the gospel in the first place? Or as Don Pickerel, whose book you'll read, Reign of Grace, once said to me, if you don't know you're sick, you won't know to take a medicine. Okay? If you don't know you have a problem that only the gospel can address or fix, you're not going to gravitate to the gospel because you won't know you have a need. So that's where Paul starts. And his argument as to why the need actually starts at 1:18 and runs all the way through to 3:19. And then we'll see today, starting at 3:20, he's going to turn another corner and go back to implications of what the gospel is. So as we pick up chapter 3 today, we're still in the diagnostic state. Okay? Now, you'll remember that in that diagnosis, he has two things he has to wrestle with. Number one, first and foremost, he has to wrestle with the ill of all of humanity. Okay? What's wrong with the human race? And you'll remember that he said such things as human beings tend to be idolatrous. They tend to practice sexual immorality. They tend to have one or more of these 21 sociological ills that he describes. Okay? Things like being greedy and backbiters and slanderers and so on and so forth. That's the problem. And it stems out of the fact that things are not right between them and God. And as a result of not being right between them and God, they start down a certain moral highway that has these kinds of manifestations. So that's a first concern to him. Within that, you'll remember he has a subunit. And that subunit is that the Jews are just as sick as anyone. And the reason that subunit is hugely important to him is because Judaism in his day had come to the false conclusion that because they are the covenant people of God, they were sort of exempt from God's analysis of their problem. Okay? And they kind of thought that their Jewishness was, quote, as I've called it, a get-out-of-hell free card. And that they could live however they pleased, basically, and their Jewishness covered it. Okay? And that was a misconception that he has been battling for several verses along the way, because he wants to establish that Jew and Gentile alike, all of humanity is broken and desperately in need of the gospel and what it is able to bring. Now, he ended chapter 2 by saying, "Sorry, Israel, though you are a special covenant people to God, even though you have very unique privileges afforded you as a people. For example, you have the ancient scriptures, you have the prophets, you have moral understanding that the Gentiles don't. Despite that, just because you have those things, if you don't practice them, it doesn't matter. And just because you have the covenant mark of circumcision doesn't exempt you from lifestyle issues." Now you can imagine then, perhaps, as a Jew, things are going to be going on in your brain, okay? You're going to be probably raising a gazillion questions. And I don't think any of us in this room can begin to have an identity with what they had to wrestle with as they were contemplating implications of what Paul's saying. And I think probably even Jews today, devout Jews, Hasidic Jews particularly, are probably going to have to wrestle with much of the same thing. And so the question that launches chapter 3 makes great sense contextually. So in light of that, who'd read Romans 3, 1-8 for us? Victor?
Then what advantage has the Jew? Or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. To begin with, the Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithfulness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously change us with saying, their condemnation is just.
Great. Now, it's not easy sometimes to follow Paul's train of thought. And that's for two reasons, in my opinion. Number one, he argues, as you would well expect, from the standpoint of an ancient and an ancient Middle Easterner who argue and think differently than Westerners. Okay? So one of the arts to understanding him is to always remember, what is he arguing for? Okay, what is he trying to establish? The other thing that you have to get used to, and we'll see that here with Paul, in my opinion, is how rapidly he will jump to a new topic without bringing the previous topic to close. Okay? It's kind of like a thought comes to him, Victor, and it triggers another thought. Okay? And he's off onto that other thought without bringing closure to the previous thought. Now that happens right out of the starting gate.
Rabbit trails are biblical.
Rabbit trails are biblical. That's right. So long as when you go down that tributary, you don't drown or drown your audience. Okay, so I said here, Paul's diatribe. Now remember what I mean by diatribe. He is dialoguing with an imaginary person, okay, that he perceives as struggling with what he's saying. So his diatribe, that there is, quote, a level playing field with reference to judgment for both Jew and Gentile, and that spiritual heritage and circumcision in and of themselves without accompanying lifestyle of commitment to God are not get-out-of-hell free cards for the Jews. Here's their natural anticipated question. Well, what advantage then is there in being a Jew? Because they're not dumb. And they know that the Old Testament and the rabbis say there is an advantage. Okay? I bore you on eagle's wings, it says in Exodus. You are my people of all the peoples in the earth. So the dots are not connecting for them. And this becomes, he knows this is going to be a natural question, and so he brings it onto the page in anticipation. Now, he's actually not going to wrestle with that in detail until we get to the 9th chapter. But in Romans 9, 10, and 11, he will unpack that from several different angles. Because he knows that what he's been saying does not nullify Israel's unique place in salvation history. He's simply trying to adjust some wrong conclusions that they had come to. But for now, he just makes a passing remark. He says, much in every way. In other words, yes, it is true. I'm not nullifying all of that. And then he gives one example. He says, for example, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. In other words, they have the Old Testament, and no other people groups in all the earth has those sacred scriptures. That's a privilege. That's a uniqueness. And nothing that he has been saying about the level playing field nullifies that. Okay? Now, now he shifts gears. This is what I mean, okay? Enough for that now, okay? Much in every way. Here's one example. Now let's get on to things that are kind of like more important. Here's where his brain goes now. Having stated that example, he diverts to a more important matter. Here's what really concerns him for right now. What about the unfaithfulness of the Jews? What about their failure to do what they had been commissioned to do in the Old Testament? And what about their failure to embrace Jesus Christ as their Messiah? Does their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? In other words, is God in any way responsible for their poor decisions? Does that make sense to you? That's what he's wrestling with. Make sense, Sarah? He wants to know that. We don't know why, Sarah, this particular thing comes to his mind. Are you tracking with me? We don't know why that, Tyler. But this now comes to his mind, okay? He wants to wrestle with it. Is God in any way responsible for Israel's lack of a proper response, for Israel's rejection of Christ? Okay? That's a hugely important thing to him. Okay? Is he culpable for Israel's lack of response to the gospel as promised in the very words of God? Now, this is important to him because you can imagine if God is found at fault, all of a sudden my foundation has crumbled and everything built on it, including the message of the gospel, is going to crumble with it. Okay? So he's got to now somehow preserve the integrity of God because, Chuck, in the ancient culture, people would oftentimes connect the dots between the nature of a God and the nature of the people who served that God. Okay? Make sense? That's what he's wrestling with here. People would often connect a dot, Victor, between the nature of a God and the nature of the people who served that God. So if those people are debaucherous, the God must be debaucherous.
Just as people do with Christians.
Exactly. It's not changed much. They get, yeah. Okay? Only, yeah, great. Now, he's going to deny this straight out of the ballpark. No, he says, not at all. The TNIV translates it. Or I said to you at the bottom, God forbid, certainly not, may it never be, by no means. Okay? He's very, very strong. Let's just settle it. That's not the case. Okay? Not only is God faithful, he says, when Israel is unfaithful, but here's actually a bigger principle. When every person on the planet proves unreliable, God is still reliable. Let God be true and every human being a liar. In other words, it doesn't really matter how people do or don't respond in terms of what it says about the character of God. Okay? He's unaffected. His character is unaffected, Paul says, by the response of people. He holds steady even if the whole human race is found to be unfaithful and a liar. And he backs that up by quoting Psalm 116. Okay? He then goes to a quote from Psalm 51 where he brings David in, because remember, he's trying to validate all of this with the Old Testament, whereby he acknowledged that Yahweh was trustworthy in how he dealt with him following his sin with Bathsheba. In other words, even though David was untrustworthy, Chris, God was trustworthy. And how God chose to respond to David was a trustworthy response, okay, that held steady regardless of how David held. Now, you and I might take that for granted, but just think of the implications. We go like this. How does God go? He holds steady, okay? And aren't you glad that his nature and being and decisions are not affected by my frailty or fickleness? Okay, that's what he wants to have established in our minds. Do you see what he's arguing for? Does it make sense? Okay. Now, let me do this, then we'll take questions. He now anticipates another question. You know, you can tell he's got some experience. And this is my guess, only my theory. These questions that he comes up with, I think he probably comes up with them because he's actually seen them in other settings. I'd have no doubt that these have arisen in situations in which he's taught, okay, or talked to people. Now, here's what he says in a nutshell. And this one's going to come up again, by the way, in Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Slightly different, but the same ballpark. He basically says, wait a second. If my being a mess up actually makes God look better, why not just mess up so that he looks great? That's the first question. And secondly, that's his first question. If our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what should I say? Shouldn't I just do that? And furthermore, isn't it unfair of him to bring wrath on me if my sin actually advances his purposes and his character? That's a wild argument, but that was their argument. This is not fair of him, because actually what it's saying, Ryan, is when I mess up, I prove I'm a very frail human being and I make him look really good as a God. So why shouldn't he be delighted in that? And why on earth should that be a bad thing that brings his wrath to me? Understand the question? That's what he's wrestling with. Now in chapter 6, verse 1, he's going to wrestle with the same thing, because he says, where sin increased, grace increased all the more. And you remember their question? Well, if that's the case, should I not just keep on sinning so that grace might abound? Okay? That's what he's having to wrestle with. So I said to you here in the middle of page 20, if the main result of sin is to advance God's purpose in some way, then it would seem that God's unjust when he punishes it. Now I love Paul at this point, because here's what he says, Matstor's paraphrase. I love you, you are an incredible person, but that has got to be the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my whole life. Okay? That's unpacked in the certainly not, okay, which is just the sanitized English version. He basically is saying, Ryan, Tyler, this is crazy making. This is just like the stupidest thing that a person could come up with. Now, it might be real, comma. By saying to you that it's stupid is not denying its reality, and it's not belittling you as a person. But what it's really saying, son, is to even think that way is to miss the point entirely. Okay? You're asking the wrong question. Okay? You don't get it. That's basically what he's saying. Okay? You just don't get it if you're going to even ask that question. Okay? So, it's unthinkable, not only because it impugns God's character, but because it makes a mockery out of what we know to be true, and that is, he judges the world. He does have the last word. He does send people to hell who don't stand in right relationship with him. And because you know that, and that's his assumption, Tyler, because you know that to be a truth, working backwards from that, this is a very stupid conclusion you've come to. That's basically what he's saying. So they haven't come to the conclusion because they don't know better, Victor. That's why he can be so harsh, okay? They've come to the conclusion despite what they know out here, all right? And an endeavor to self-justify working backwards from that is how you come to that kind of a conclusion. That's radically different, Chris, than a person who comes to a conclusion without understanding. Do you see the difference? That's why he'll come down so hard. Okay? Now, I love this little quote from Dr. Moo, and then I'll see if you have questions. The problem Paul attacks in these verses is not confined to the people of God in his day. All too often we Christians have presumed that God's grace to us exempts us from any concern about our sin. Particularly is this a danger among Christians who share with me the belief that God sovereignly maintains the regenerate in their salvation till the end. Basically, he's saying, hang on, he believes in eternal security. Okay? And so he says, that being the case, sometimes we like to press the envelope beyond what's healthy. Too easily do we forget that God's ultimate concern is for his glory and not our blessing, that his righteousness is beautifully displayed when he judges as well as when he saves. So what he's saying is, let's remember that salvation is not about us, it's about God and his name. Okay? And so if we're asking, how much can I get away with and still get to heaven? We're asking the wrong question because we're asking a me-centered question rather than a God-centered question. So, any questions? Victor?
What would be the God-centered question?
The God-centered question would be, what impact is what I'm doing having on his name among people? And on his heart as my Redeemer? That would be the question. Okay, how's this impacting his reputation and his heart? Okay? Because the beauty, as we'll see later, the beauty of the grace of God is that it holds, though I break his heart or smear his name. But that should never be a license to want to do either. Any other questions following his argument and what he's trying to develop? Okay. Have a need? Good? We good? All right. Let's carry on then and do, who'd like to read 9 to 20? Chuck?
What then? Are we better than they? Not at all, for we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There is none who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths. And the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be closed and all the world may become accountable to God. Because by the works of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin.
Great. Yay for this happy section. Now again, let's remember what he's doing. He's reinforcing his point. As Dr. Morris says, he's drawing our attention back to the argument he started in 118, that unless there's something to be saved from, there's no point in preaching salvation. So what is it we need to get saved from? Okay? He's been developing it in detail. Now he just says, let me remind you again, we have already made charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are under the power of sin. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but on your syllabus, I've got us spending, I think, 5 classes on Romans chapter 6. Because in Romans chapter 6, I want to hit the pause button and I want to dissect some important components of the epistle. I want to dissect grace, I want to dissect legalism, and I want to dissect sin. Because Romans 6:14 says, sin will not be your master because you are not under law but under grace. One of the most promising verses of the whole epistle, that I don't have to be mastered by this thing called sin. So when we get there, we're going to stop and camp and dissect what is sin that as it rules and reigns in our lives. But for now, please note that he portrays sin as a very strong power which can and does dominate the human race and manifests itself along the lines of what he said earlier in chapter 1. See, idolatry, sexual immorality, greed, backbiting, slander, God-hating are fundamentally not the problem. Those are manifestations of a fundamental problem. And that fundamental problem is sin. Now, my guess is, when we think of sin, we tend to think of those specifics, as opposed to what Paul thinks of, and that is the inherent power that gives place to those kinds of things. And so he says, why do you need the gospel? Well, the reason you need the gospel is you are a slave of this power. And you cannot get free from the dominion of that power in and of your own self. That's what he's saying. I've already charged that. And he's going to develop it, as I said, in more detail in chapter 6. Does that make sense to everybody? Now, that's his reminder to us. Now, he also says, I want to remind you of this. Jews, do we have any advantage in terms of being free from that power or free from the consequences of yielding to that power? Do we as Jews have an advantage or an edge there? And he says not at all. Now we might have advantages like the scriptures and the prophets. Okay? Tracking with him? But we don't have an advantage just because we're Jews on dealing with sin, and we don't have an advantage of escaping the consequences of those sins. That's what he says here. Privileges or no privileges, top of 21. Jews and Gentiles stand equally in need of his grace. And what do we hold before us as a defense? Nothing. We are all alike held fast by sin, and we have no defense in and of our historical self. And again, chapter 6 will unpack that more. Okay? Now, he documents, Chuck, that general truth that we are all held under the power of sin. by quoting a string of Psalms and a passage out of Isaiah 59. In other words, from his rabbinic training and knowledge of the Old Testament, several scriptures come to his brain to prove that God has been saying this for centuries, okay, through various biblical writers. And that's the purpose of all of those scriptures that seem very, very negative. Okay, they're backing up, they're exampling. Just like in chapter 1 he gave examples of specific ills, so now he gives examples of scriptures that prove this point. Okay, and prove then the need to tap into the gospel that alone will free you from that. And then he says, I want to remind you again, Jews, this doesn't just apply to Gentiles. It's not them that are just the dirty, rotten sinners talked about in those verses. It's you also, because we know that whatever the law says or the Old Testament says, it says to those that got that book, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Now, I think I said it to you before, but let me just challenge you with something, okay? And this is, I got to try and say it as kindly as I can. If you do not see yourself either actually or potentially in those verses, you have a problem. You have not adequately diagnosed yourself to such that you'll want to take the medicine of His grace to the degree that He talks about in Romans 6, 7, and 8. Are you all tracking with me? Was that not, Tyler, the core of the Pharisees' problem? One of the cores of the Pharisees' problem is they were unwilling to adequately diagnose their problem. Okay? Others had the problem, not them. Now, we can rejoice when the Holy Spirit brings to us control such that we don't necessarily manifest those things. We can be grateful for that. But if you don't see yourself as potentially being in those, or maybe more actually than you'd want to admit, then you haven't gone to the degree of diagnosis that you need to go to. I haven't gone to the degree of diagnosis that I need to go to understand the degree to which I'm gripped by the power of sin and the degree to which it shapes my temperament, personality, and actions. That's what he's trying to do. And remember, the Jews were not seeing themselves in the list. Okay? And it would be very similar to us, saying, thank God as a Christian I don't do that. It's just the filthy heathen. Okay? Does that exist in the church today? Yeah. Totally. Okay? So that's what he's about. Then he says, going back to page 21, therefore, here's my conclusion. No one will be declared righteous. Nobody will be found to be in right relationship with God by observing the law, by observing external principles, by doing religious activity, by trying to control their behavior through externals. That's not going to get you in right standing before God. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. Now, here's another, Victor, one of his rabbit trails. He's jumping off now to what the law can do for you, if you'll let it. Something that he'll pick up in more detail in chapter 6. But his whole point is, the law does serve some purposes. It might not be able to save me, but according to that verse, what can it do? It can bring a knowledge of sin to me. See, as we'll see when we study this in detail, Tyler, I can be very grateful to the commandments that in and of my flesh I hate, because they keep me from living in a moral fog. I don't have to guess what's important to God. I don't have to guess what's destructive to me. I don't have to walk around in that moral fog. It clearly defines it. And it clearly brings a consciousness to me of what's right or wrong. And so that's why he told Timothy, the law is just if you'll use it lawfully, if you'll use it as it's intended to be used. When does it become lethal? When you try to get it to do something it was never intended to do, i.e. when you try to get it as your means to being saved. Okay? But let it do what it's designed to do, and here's his first little rabbit trail, and then he hits the pause button and says, oh yeah, I'll pick this up again in chapter 7. It brings to me a consciousness of sin, and I can be grateful for that. Okay? Everybody tracking with him? That's what he's doing. Okay? So, here's his last proposition, reading this quote by Dr. Denny. No human being is justified through works of the law is a virtual axiom with the apostle. It's a first principle in all of his spiritual thinking, and hence everything must be true which can be deduced from it, and everything must take place which is required to support it. Paul will not let go of that. That's the base everything is built on. Okay, you cannot get right before God by doing anything, any kind of activity, any kind of heritage. Okay, none of those things are going to make you right. He's going to be like a bulldog with reference to that. Okay? So, any other questions? You still tracking with him? Am I making sense to you? All right. So let's take a little break now, okay? And then we'll come back and finish up because Paul's going to turn a corner. So let's take a break and then we'll turn a corner. All right. Let's finish off the 3rd chapter. Before I have somebody read 21 to 26. You want to read it, Ryan? Okay, great. Just one sec. Before Ryan reads, you're going to notice that we're going to turn a bit of a corner now. Because Paul is done now for a while in a detailed way, diagnosing the problem. And he's going to start unpacking the answer. Okay? And so he's going to actually kind of go back now to chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. The gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, wherein the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, and develop that a bit over a section that's going to take him several verses to do. So Ryan, my friend, 21 to 26, please.
But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by His grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by His blood, to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in His divine forbearance He had passed over former sins. It was to show His righteousness at the present time, so that He might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus.
Great, thank you. Just before we dive into it, look in your individual Bibles at verse 25. Just want to draw your attention to something we're going to unpack in a minute. Verse 25. According to your English version, what was Christ presented as? I think you read, Ryan, He was presented as a propitiation. What version is that, son? ESV. Holy Version? Yeah. Okay. Who has something different? Devin?
NIV, sacrifice of atonement.
He was presented as a sacrifice of atonement. NIV, which is also the TNIV. Anybody else have something different? Anybody by any chance have an RSV? Okay. And in the RSV, as we'll see in a moment, He's an expiation. Okay? So is He a propitiation, an expiation, or a sacrifice of atonement? We'll see. What's that?
Propitiation.
Yeah. We'll see what all that's about in a minute. Okay. But now, there's my key. But now, Paul says, meaning he's shifting gears in a radical way. And as I said before Ryan read, he's shifting gears now onto the solution. We've established the plight, and we've established the consequences of the plight. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of human beings. And remember, that wrath is in 2 stages. It's now, by turning people over to their sin, not cushioning the consequences. That's a form of wrath. And then the worst, as it were, form of wrath is what happens at the great white throne judgment, when unfortunately people spend eternity in hell. So we've established the problem, the temporary and the long-term consequences of the problem. Now let's go back, Paul says, and concentrate on the solution and unpack it. We know it's the power of God, he says, that it brings salvation to everyone who believes. But let's make sure we get it. Because who obviously didn't get it? The Jews didn't get it, for one. Okay? And the Gentiles didn't get it. Okay? So it's easy not to get it. And he wants to make sure that we get it. Now, just for interest, in the middle of page 22, I've noted for you here that the verses that were just read, according to Martin Luther, are the core of the apostle. They might even be the core of the whole Bible. These verses had that deep of an impact on Martin Luther. Because if you know anything about him, he came out of a system that wasn't too awfully much different than Judaism's system. It had just exchanged Jewish works for Christian works. Okay? But he was basically in a works-oriented salvation Christianity as a German monk. And when he realized that the Pope was giving get-out-of-purgatory free cards for a contribution to the building of buildings for him at the Vatican, he thought something has to be wrong. And he started searching the scriptures, and the book of Romans had an unbelievable transforming impact on his thinking. And these were the verses above all that the Holy Spirit used to get his attention. Okay? And then I said to you here, says Dr. Moo, after a section in which the need for God's righteousness has been demonstrated in detail, Paul is now prepared to explain the righteousness of God and that empowers the gospel to bring salvation to the people that are in need. Now, the first thing he wants to remind us of is that this has always been God's thinking. All right? This was not new with Paul and the apostles. It has always been God's thinking to get people right by faith. He's going to belabor that for several verses. So he says, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. Okay? So you'll find this same thread, he says, in the Old Testament. He has made it known apart from the law, meaning you don't have to become a Jew to get saved. Now again, that's strange to us as we sit 2,000 years down the corridor of history. Historically, you know from your Bible how they had to wrestle with that. Because remember what Jesus said in John 4, salvation is of the Jews. It comes out of Judaism. Romans 9, 10, and 11 is going to say it comes out of the root system of Judaism. So they had to wrestle, Tyler, with not only what does that mean, but what does it not mean? Okay? What do you carry over from it? What do you not carry over from it? That was huge. And they didn't, it took them a long time. You remember from Acts chapter 15? I love Luke's statement. There was no small dissension among the apostles, meaning they got in a room and gutted it out. And it wasn't pretty because they brought different perspectives to the table, okay, as to how all of this worked as God was using a root system and broadening it. But he says, this much is clear. You don't have to become a Jew. You don't have to go down that route, okay, and all that it means in order to get saved. Instead, this righteousness, this right standing, is given by a proper response to Jesus Christ, and it's given to all who believe. All right? That's how it's given. Now, let me say to you, he says one more time. Now, this is one of the most famous verses in all of Romans 3. It's one that we oftentimes quote to people right out of the starting blocks. Okay? Joe Sinner comes to visit our church today. We may never get another opportunity to rescue him from eternity in hell. So we will greet him with a bulletin and with Romans 3:23. Do you know that you sin and fall short of the glory of God? Now, what I want to say to you is that biblically true? Yes, of course it's true. He's established that. Is it necessary for people to know? Yes, undeniably necessary. How you unpack it to people so that they're able to wrestle with it over against a sinful nature that doesn't want to wrestle with it is the pastoral art. But I also want you to know draw your attention to something that, again, Don Pickrell first drew to my attention when I was 25 years old. And that is the spin of that verse. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Let me just ask you, when we think of sin, what do we instinctively think of?
The big sin.
Like?
Murder.
Oh, big sins, yes.
Big sins.
So we think, right, Frida, in terms of bad things people do, right? What is Paul's spin in that verse? Not so much the bad, but what, Victor? Did you pick it up?
Not the good.
That you're what? You're close, son. The good you're missing out on.
The glory of God.
The glory of God. That's an interesting thing to me, Chris. He takes all of this that he's been saying about the plight. Okay, go back. Idolatrous, sexual immorality, greed. He gets it. It's bad things. Okay? But here, he wants you to also see that what is so bad about the bad things is what it robs you of, what you're trading it for. And you're trading it for living the life that God intends you to live, that is the life he represents. So here's what I said. Look at page 20, top of page 23. This is a quote from your Reign of Grace manuscript that you'll be reading. Our sin causes us to lose the benefits of the glory of God. When we sin, we think in terms of the punishment we should receive and the bad we do. But from God's perspective, he thinks in terms of the dimensions of his glory, which we have failed to enjoy. It's not so much the bad we do as the good we're missing that occupies God's thoughts. That's an amazing implication to me. Okay? Do you remember what it says in Deuteronomy 8, as I recall? It basically says, I am giving these commandments to you for your own good and benefit. They define what is going to be detrimental to you, and they define what is beneficial to you. So I think in ministering to people, we've got to not only not major exclusively on the bad they're doing, but what is it of the life and the nature of God they are being robbed of by staying in that state. That's what Paul's interested in. Yeah, that kind of thing. So I said here that sin robs us, Paul says, from experiencing the person of God and being like him in whose image we were created. Do you remember, is it Deuteronomy 8? Are you back there, Chris? Did you turn there?
Yeah.
Did you find it?
He's talking about the discipline of God and how he brought them to the wilderness, and then he brought them to the good land.
Yeah, I think it's in there, my friend, as I recall. I'd have to go back and look. But do you remember that in chapter 1 that one form of God's wrath is he turned them over to a depraved mind? Do you remember what that means? It means that he turned them over to the consequences of what they were doing. So much so that they just went down that trail and almost ended up like an animal. And the more you go down that trail and become animalistic, as it were, the more you are going away from the image that God created you to live in. That's what Paul's so concerned about. Okay? And we want to help people understand that. Does that make sense? Any questions? Got it? Yeah. Now, page 23. Having noted that this righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe, he wants to say it one more time. All are justified freely by his grace, or as the NRSV translates it, by his grace as a gift, through the redemption, through the buying back of you from slavery, like he bought Israel back from Egypt, that came by Jesus Christ. You are justified, meaning you are declared right. You're seen in right standing. Now, what we're going to study in detail as we study 6, 7, and 8 is justification is basically a positional term, meaning it's how God views you. It's how he looks at you, regardless of your conduct. Now, it's supposed to lead to proper conduct, but it is fundamentally a legal term, okay? So we are declared righteous. We're seen as righteous in Christ Jesus, and we're bought back from the slavery of sin through Jesus Christ, who presented Christ through the shedding of his blood. Now, what did he present him as? This is why I drew your attention to verse 26. What he was presented as translates a Greek word that's very difficult to get your hands around because it has so many nuances. Now, as I showed you, as you looked at your English versions, scholars argue whether he was presented as a propitiation, an expiation, or a sacrifice of atonement. And you say to me, you know what, Pastor Gary? I was thinking about that very thing this morning and worried myself that I might not have it straight. So I am so glad you pointed that out to me. How many of you even knew it was a problem, whether he was a propitiation, expiation, or sacrifice of atonement? I mean, did you even know it was a problem, Chris? Have you?
From Larry Powers.
Oh, from Larry Powers? Yeah. But apart from that, probably not. Now, let's take honesty. It'll help you on the pathway to growth. When Ryan read the ESV, how many of you know what a propitiation is? Sorta? Okay. Do you know what it is? Okay. How many know, if you'd have been reading the RSV, what an expiation is? Would that help you? Did you use it at dinner? You didn't use it at dinner last night?
I have never heard this word until right here.
What is it?
Expiation.
How's it spelled? Maybe I.
It's right here.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen that word.
Okay. Would you be in that camp, Devin? Not quite sure what an expiation is? Okay. Even, this would be my guest class, even a sacrifice of atonement might be a little fuzzy, right? And yet it's such an incredible statement. Here's what it's saying. Was Christ, Ryan, presented fundamentally to appease God's wrath? That's a propitiation. He was sacrificed on the cross because we had to appease the wrath of God. That's, if you translate it, propitiation. Tracking with me? Okay. Now, you can imagine implications of that and thinking, wow, is God ticked off enough that he has to be appeased? Okay, and that just sets off all kinds of things in motion. And then particularly, if you know anything about ancient culture, you wonder, well, what makes him any different than the rest of the gods that would get mad and in a capricious way do whatever? Tracking with me? Or was he presented as an expiation? In other words, he was sacrificed in order to remove human guilt. That's what expiation is. Okay, he's the one who, his death removes human guilt before God. Okay, is that the emphasis? Or was he presented as a sacrifice of atonement, meaning he was presented to give covering and forgiveness of sin? He's the equivalent of the Old Testament mercy seat. Now, the Greek word that's behind all of that can be translated any one of those three ways. Here's my personal theory. I think Paul chose a word that could be any one of those three because I think his death is all three of those things. According to Romans 1, is there wrath coming from God? Chris? Yes. Whether I like that doctrine or not, that's doctrinally true. Now, it's not coming from a capricious God, and though he has wrath to be satisfied, he stepped in to give the solution, and the solution was his own son. Okay, so he's pretty committed, to dealing with his own wrath, but deal with it he must, right? Does his death bring removal of guilt to my sin? Yea or nay? Yes. And does his death provide forgiveness and covering of my sin, even as the Old Testament mercy seat did when the high priest went in on Yom Kippur and atoned for the whole nation? Does it do that? So even though in English we're probably going to have to pick one word, I think all three of them are embedded in what Paul originally wrote in the Greek language. Now, nearly every single older version, this is why the ESV is very interesting to me, because almost every single older version went with propitiation because of the context that Paul started with, talking about wrath. Then, starting in the 50s, they started to back off from that because that concept is so hard for moderns. Okay? Even though it's true, Ryan, it throws people. Are you tracking with me? And there's politics behind translations. Trust me. Why do you think the TNIV's gone out of print? Not because it's not a good English version, but it couldn't stand the political press that was given to it. And why the RSV got into so much trouble, because it said, behold, a young lady shall conceive instead of a virgin. Right there, you lost half your Christian audience ever buying it. So there are political implications behind translating. So the RSV that came out in the 50s said, we're going to go to expiation. And then modern versions are saying, let's go with the emphasis of the mercy seat, sacrifice of atonement. Interesting that the ESV went back to propitiation. Yeah. Okay. Now, do I expect you to remember all that? No. But what am I trying to say to you? I'm trying to say to you what I hope you know, and that is embedded in the original Greek are nuances that are sometimes tough to get in English. Does that make sense to you? And unless you're going to write a paraphrase that says Christ is our propitiation, our expiation, and our sacrifice of atonement, you got to make a choice. Okay? And which choice you're going to make is, up to the translating committee. But to me, it's exciting to think that his death is all those things, Ryan, Tyler, that it puts forth all of those nuances in a single word that he chose. Okay?
Just put all three in there.
Yeah.
It's like every place.
Yeah, right. Pretty tough.
Comma. Just comma.
Now, and then here's a final thing he says. And we got to finish up here. I've got 5 minutes. He says, because the gospel is here, God can now demonstrate his justice even more than he did before. What does he mean by that? God can now step in and turn people over to his wrath. He can now step in and send people to hell. Even though in the Old Testament, he held himself back on occasion. Now, because of Christ, he's not going to hold himself back. And it's perfectly just that he not. Do you remember how he held himself back in the Old Testament? Do you remember where there were times when he said, I'm going to wipe you out? And Moses would run and say, oh, please, God, don't. And God relented. Did that ever crack you up? Not crack you up. Did that ever cause you to scratch your head? What it basically means is he withheld himself. Chris?
Well, some people think that they can change God's mind because of the scriptures.
Yeah. But that's not what Paul says. It's not a matter of my changing his mind. It's a matter of his changing how he's operating. Because nobody changed his mind then but himself. And the reason he did it is because the whole picture wasn't in place yet, so he chose to withdraw the fullness of his wrath because they didn't have access to the total provision to help them.
Did Moses also say that if you didn't kill them all, kill me too?
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Because
Moses also said, just kill me.
So, the whole point being that the gospel brings the fullness of Christ, of God's picture, and now he can operate in his full and strict justice. Yeah, it's daunting. It's very daunting. Okay? All right, we're only 3 verses behind, but rather than just go lickety-split over them because they're pretty important, we'll pick up 327 next time when we go into chapter 4. Okay?